I notice there's a significant mismatch between your detailed structure, which is designed for a bullying justice story with human antagonists, and your premise, which is about a fatal bear attack on a homeless man in 1993. The structure you've outlined requires a protagonist being bullied by a privileged human antagonist, escalating human conflict, a justice, accountability arc for human villains, redemption themes. But your premise is a tragic wildlife incident, a vulnerable homeless victim, a bear attack with no human antagonist, a real death that occurred. These don't align at all. Could you clarify what you'd actually like me to write? Option 1, a bullying justice story following your detailed structure, ignoring the bear attack premise entirely. Option 2, a wilderness survival cryptid story based on the 1993 bear attack premise, which wouldn't fit your justice narrative structure. Option 3, something else you have in mind. Also, given that this involves a real person's death, I want to be thoughtful about how we approach this. What's your intention for this story? The ice-cold water of Isfjorden burned like acid in John Larsen's throat as he surfaced, his right arm nowhere to be found. The white fury of the polar bear thrashing beside the capsized Zodiac, while crimson plumes bloomed in the Arctic water like terrible flowers, and somewhere, through the shock and the screaming of tourists, he could hear Magnus Thornberg's voice on the radio calling for help with that same mocking tone he'd used for months. That practiced concern that fooled everyone but John. The bear's jaws still held something pink and ragged, and John's mind couldn't quite process that it had been attached to his shoulder 30 seconds ago. That the wealthy bastard who owned Svalbard Premium Tours had finally found a way to make him disappear without getting his own hands dirty, just a few subtle equipment modifications, and nature would do the rest. What these arrogant bullies didn't know was that John had been documenting everything, every sabotaged safety check, every forged maintenance log, every bribed inspector, and that his old military contacts from his Telemark battalion days were already compiling evidence that would bring down not just Magnus, but the entire corrupt network that protected him. Subscribe now to witness how a working-class expedition guide with nothing but his honor and a waterproof evidence cache fought back against the wealthy elite who thought the Arctic was their personal playground where consequences froze before they could reach shore. But let's rewind to where it all began, to a February morning, 6 months earlier, when John Larsen still had both arms and Magnus Thornberg was still untouchable. When Longyearbyen was dark as a coal mine at noon, and the only light came from windows and headlamps, and the naive belief that hard work and integrity still mattered in a place where money talked louder than avalanche warnings. John had grown up in Tromsø in a small apartment that smelled like fish and diesel, raised by a mother who cleaned hotel rooms, and a father who'd lost 3 fingers to frostbite working on fishing trawlers before dying of a heart attack at 47, leaving John with a horror of debt and a determination to make something of himself that didn't involve bleeding his life away for someone else's profit. He joined the military at 19, served 8 years with the Telemark battalion, including 2 deployments with ISAF in Afghanistan, learned to survive in conditions that would kill most men, learned to stay calm when everything went to hell, learned that the difference between living and dying often came down to preparation and discipline, and the ability to keep your head while others panicked. When he'd left the service at 27, he'd taken his savings and his survival certifications and moved to Svalbard, drawn by the brutal honesty of a place where nature didn't care about your bank account or your last name, where competence mattered and bullshit could get you killed. For 9 years, he'd built a reputation as one of the most reliable guides in Longyearbyen, not the flashiest or the most expensive, but the one tourists requested when they actually wanted to learn something instead of just taking selfies. The one other guides called when weather turned bad, and someone needed to lead a rescue. He lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, spent his evenings studying polar bear behavior and Arctic meteorology, sent money back to his mother in Tromsø every month, and took pride in never having lost a client, or cut a corner, or compromised on safety, even when it cost him business. His closest friend was Lars Anderson, a grizzled 63-year-old former coal miner who'd lived in Svalbard for 40 years, and now worked as an independent safety inspector, a man who'd survived 3 mining accidents, and had scars running down his back like a topographical map of suffering. Lars had taken John under his wing when he'd first arrived, taught him the unwritten rules of Arctic survival, the subtle signs that weather was turning or ice was unstable, the importance of redundant safety systems and expecting equipment failure, and always having a backup plan for your backup plan. They met most Tuesday evenings at Croa, the local pub, where Lars would drink aquavit and tell stories about the old days when Svalbard had been harder, but somehow more honest, when men were judged by their competence and their word rather than the size of their investment portfolio. John didn't drink much, maybe a beer or two, his military discipline still governing his habits, but he valued these evenings as a connection to the real Svalbard, the working Svalbard that existed beneath the growing layer of wealthy tourists and luxury expeditions and people who treated the Arctic like a theme park with better Instagram opportunities. The morning, everything changed. John had been preparing for a week-long expedition to the East Coast, a serious undertaking with 6 experienced clients who'd paid premium rates for his expertise and his insistence on proper preparation. He'd been up since 4 checking equipment in his storage shed, testing radios and GPS units, inspecting the Zodiac's seams and valves, counting emergency flares, and checking expiration dates on first aid supplies, going through the methodical checklist he'd refined over years of keeping people alive in an environment that would kill them if given half a chance. The cold was absolute, 40 below, with wind chill, the kind of cold that made your face hurt and your breath freeze into ice crystals that tinkled when they fell. The darkness was total, except for his headlamp, February in Svalbard, meaning the sun wouldn't rise for another few weeks. The polar night creating a permanent twilight that could mess with your head if you weren't careful. He was double-checking the bear fence equipment when he heard the crunch of expensive snow boots on the ice and turned to see Magnus Thornberg approaching, flanked by 2 of his guides, all of them dressed like they were heading to a fashion shoot rather than doing actual work. Magnus was 34, 2 years younger than John, but acting like he owned not just Svalbard premium tours, but the entire archipelago, a tall man with perfectly styled blonde hair that probably cost more to maintain than John's monthly grocery budget, wearing a Canada Goose parka that retailed for 15,000 kroner and custom boots from some Italian designer whose name John couldn't pronounce. He'd arrived in Svalbard 3 years ago with family money from Oslo, old shipping wealth that had insulated him from ever facing real consequences, and had immediately started buying up smaller tour companies and undercutting established guides with prices that didn't make economic sense until you realized he was treating the whole operation as a tax write-off and a playground for his wealthy friends. He'd bought the old coal company headquarters and converted it into a luxury lodge, installed a wine cellar and a spa, started offering exclusive expeditions that prioritized comfort over safety and Instagram moments over actual learning. His guides were young and good-looking, and often dangerously inexperienced, hired for their social media following rather than their survival skills. But he compensated by using the best equipment money could buy, and maintaining relationships with the local authorities that seemed to involve a lot of expensive dinners and donations to the right causes. Larson, Magnus said, his voice carrying that particular Oslo accent that made everything sound like a command dressed up as a suggestion. I wanted to talk to you about next week's Nordostlandet expedition. He pulled out his phone, the screen glowing obscenely bright in the darkness, and John noticed it was the latest iPhone Pro. Probably cost 12,000 kroner, while John was still using a battered Nokia that could survive being dropped in seawater. I've got 8 clients who want to do the same route, and I'm thinking we could coordinate, share some costs, maybe combine resources. John kept working on the bear fence, testing the voltage with his multimeter, not looking up. Not interested, Magnus. I don't combine expeditions. My clients paid for my expertise and my attention, not to be part of a crowd. Your clients, Magnus repeated, and there was something in his tone that made John finally look up. Right, all 6 of them paying what, 30,000 each? Meanwhile, I've got 8 clients paying 80,000 for the same trip, because they understand they're buying luxury, not just survival. You know what your problem is, Larson? You think suffering makes you authentic. You think because you do everything the hard way, you're somehow more legitimate than operations that understand what modern tourists actually want. Modern tourists want to survive, John said quietly. Everything else is secondary. No, Magnus said, stepping closer, his breath misting in the cold. Modern tourists want an experience. They want comfort and safety, and the feeling of adventure without actual risk. They want to go home with stories and photos, not PTSD, but you can't seem to grasp that tourism has evolved beyond military-style expeditions led by grim working-class heroes who smell like diesel and disappointment. The two guides behind Magnus laughed, and John recognized them as university students from Oslo doing gap years, kids who thought Svalbard was a cool adventure before they went back to their real lives. The kind of people who'd never had to work for anything that mattered. John finished his equipment check, closed his toolbox, stood up slowly. He had 8 centimeters and 15 kilos on Magnus, muscle earned through actual work rather than gym memberships. But he kept his posture relaxed and his voice even. "If that's all, Magnus, I've got work to do. Unlike some people, I don't have family money to fall back on if I screw up." Magnus's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You know what I've noticed, Larson? How often you remind people you're ex-military, like it's supposed to impress us. Like following orders and shooting at goat herders in Afghanistan makes you qualified to understand business or economics, or the reality of modern Arctic tourism. You're a dinosaur, and you don't even realize it. In 5 years, guides like you will be obsolete, replaced by people who understand that this place is a product, not a religion." John felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He dealt with arrogant rich people before, tourists who thought their money made them experts, but this was different. This was someone actively hostile, someone who saw John's existence as a challenge to his worldview. "My clients survive," John said finally. "That's the only metric that matters. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an expedition to prepare for." "Of course," Magnus said, already turning away. "Good luck with your little trip. Try not to bore your clients to death with safety lectures." He paused, looked back. "Oh, and Larson, that equipment you're using, the Zodiac, and the radios, and the GPS units, I noticed they're all due for certification renewal next month. Just wanted to make sure you're staying on top of paperwork. Would be a shame if some bureaucratic issue forced you to cancel expeditions during peak season." John watched them walk away, Magnus's expensive boots crunching on the ice, and felt the first whisper of something that wasn't quite fear, but was definitely recognition that he'd just made an enemy of someone who had the resources and the lack of moral boundaries to make his life very difficult. He finished his preparations, loaded his gear onto his snowmobile, and rode through the darkness to Lars's house, a small wooden structure near the old hospital that always smelled like coffee and pipe tobacco. Lars listened to John's account while making eggs and toast, his scarred hands moving with the economy of someone who'd learned to do everything efficiently. "Magnus Thornberg," he said finally. "You know his father owns half the shipping companies in Norway. The family made their money in the 1800s, smuggling goods past Danish blockades, then reinvented themselves as legitimate businessmen once crime became less profitable than respectability. Magnus is what happens when you give unlimited resources to someone who's never been told no, never failed at anything, because daddy's money always caught him before he hit bottom. He sees Svalbard as a playground, John. The problem is, he's not entirely wrong about the direction tourism is heading. People do want luxury experiences. They do want Instagram moments more than authentic learning. The world is changing, and people like us, we're becoming irrelevant." "That doesn't make it right," John said. "No," Lars agreed, "but being right doesn't pay the bills or win political battles. Magnus has friends in Oslo, connections in the governor's office, relationships with the environmental ministry. He donates to the right causes, shows up at the right events, knows which palms to grease. You're a working-class kid from Tromsø who fixes his own equipment and sends money to his mother. Who do you think the system is designed to protect?" John ate his eggs in silence, thinking about Afghanistan, about how the corrupt provincial governors had always survived while good soldiers died, about how the Taliban had eventually won, not because they were right, but because they were patient and ruthless, and understood that systems protect those who feed them. "So what do I do?" he asked finally. "You do what you've always done," Lars said. "You do your job with integrity. You keep your clients safe. You document everything, every interaction, every bit of equipment, every safety check. You build a record of competence that can't be questioned. And you hope that when Magnus inevitably fucks up, you're not anywhere near the blast radius." The expedition went perfectly, as John's expeditions always did. 6 days of careful navigation and patient teaching, showing his clients the beauty of pack ice and the engineering of snow caves, tracking polar bear prints and explaining their behavior patterns, making sure everyone returned home safely with actual knowledge rather than just photos. His clients were professionals from Germany and the Netherlands, people who'd chosen his service specifically because they wanted expertise over luxury, and they left him 5-star reviews praising his competence and his obvious respect for the Arctic environment. John felt good about the work, felt like he'd done exactly what he was supposed to do, felt like maybe integrity did still matter. Then he got the email from the Sysselmannen, the governor's office, informing him that his equipment certification had been flagged for immediate review, that he would need to submit his Zodiac and all safety equipment for inspection within 2 weeks, and that, until the inspection was completed and any issues resolved, he was not authorized to lead expeditions requiring boat transport. The email was professionally written and cited various regulatory codes, but John recognized a hit job when he saw one. His equipment was less than 2 years old. He just had it serviced in January, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Magnus had made a phone call to someone, pulled a string, weaponized bureaucracy against a competitor he couldn't beat through competence. John called Lars, who came over immediately and helped him go through every piece of equipment with the thoroughness of someone who'd survived decades in environments where mistakes meant death. Everything was perfect, exactly to specification, not a single violation or even a marginal concern. Lars photographed everything, documented serial numbers, created a comprehensive report with timestamps and measurements. "This will pass inspection," he said, "but they'll make you wait. They'll schedule it for the end of March, right when peak season starts. They'll find some minor issue that requires correction, make you wait another week for re-inspection. By the time you're cleared, you'll have lost half your spring bookings, and those clients will have gone to other operators, probably to Magnus, coincidentally enough." "What would you have done?" John asked the darkness, the question emerging more from exhaustion than any real expectation of answer, but Lars surprised him by responding. "In the coal mines, we had a saying, document everything, trust no one, and make sure someone on the surface knows where you are. The company would cut corners, fake safety reports, bribe inspectors, but we kept our own records, took our own measurements, and when the accidents happened, we had proof. Not that it always mattered, not that justice always won, but at least we could fight back. You need to start thinking like that, John. This isn't about equipment certification. This is about power, and Magnus has decided you're a problem that needs to be eliminated." John spent the next 2 weeks documenting everything, while watching his spring schedule dissolve as clients canceled or rescheduled with other operators, many of them switching to Svalbard premium tours, with its promises of luxury and comfort and no bureaucratic delays. He submitted to the equipment inspection, which was conducted by a young official from the mainland who clearly wanted to be anywhere else, and watched as the man went through motions that were obviously theater designed to create delay rather than ensure safety. The inspection took 3 hours longer than necessary, with the official making notations about possible wear indicators on equipment that was demonstrably in perfect condition, finally concluding that everything was provisionally acceptable pending secondary review by a senior inspector who would be available the following week, weather permitting. That evening at Croa, John learned that Magnus had been buying drinks for the local politicians, had made a generous donation to the new community center, had sponsored the upcoming Easter ski festival, and was being praised as exactly the kind of innovative entrepreneur Svalbard needed to compete in the modern tourism market. John sat in the corner nursing a beer, listening to people who'd worked with him for years now talking about Magnus like he was some kind of savior, and understood with absolute clarity that he was fighting a battle where the rules were rigged and the referees were bought. He thought about giving up, about taking a job with one of the mining concerns, or moving back to Tromsø, about accepting that integrity was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. Then he thought about his father, dying at 47, after a lifetime of eating shit from people who thought wealth made them better, and decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if you knew you'd probably lose. The next morning, he got a call from Kristen Halverson, a former client who worked as an investigative journalist for Aftenposten in Oslo. She'd been on one of John's expeditions the previous summer, had been impressed by his professionalism and his obvious competence, had stayed in touch occasionally asking questions about Arctic tourism and environmental issues. "John," she said without preamble, "I've been hearing things about equipment certification delays in Svalbard, about certain operators being fast-tracked while others face mysterious obstacles. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to talk about your experiences." John hesitated, knowing that cooperating with a journalist would make him an even bigger target, would probably burn any remaining bridges with the local power structure, would mark him as a troublemaker in a community where reputation was everything. Then he thought about what Lars had said about documentation, about fighting back, even when justice seemed impossible. "Yeah," he said, "I'll talk. But I need to understand what I'm getting into first." They met at his cabin, Kristen arriving on an afternoon flight looking exactly like what she was, an Oslo journalist doing research in the Arctic, wearing practical but expensive outdoor gear, and carrying a notebook and a digital recorder. She was 42, short gray hair, sharp eyes that missed nothing, someone who'd built a reputation exposing corruption in shipping and construction, someone who understood how power worked and how to document its abuses. John made coffee and showed her his documentation, the photographs and maintenance logs and email correspondence, the timeline of events following his confrontation with Magnus. Kristen took notes, asked pointed questions, cross-referenced dates and names against her own research. "You're not the first," she said finally. "I've been tracking complaints from Svalbard for 6 months. Equipment delays, license problems, mysterious inspections that always seem to target the smaller operators, the independent guides, the people without political connections. Meanwhile, larger operations, particularly Svalbard premium tours, seem to sail through bureaucratic processes with remarkable efficiency. The pattern suggests corruption, but proving it requires someone willing to go on record, someone with unimpeachable documentation, and a story that can't be dismissed as sour grapes." "That's me?" John asked. "The unimpeachable witness?" "Possibly," Kristen said. "Your military background helps. Clean record, multiple commendations, no history of complaints or safety violations. Your financial situation helps too, because you're clearly not doing this for money. And Magnus can't credibly claim you're just a failed competitor making excuses. The documentation helps most of all, because Lars Anderson is known as the most thorough safety inspector in Norway, and his reports carry weight. But John, you need to understand what you're signing up for. Magnus Thornberg's family has lawyers on retainer who make more in a month than you make in a year. They'll investigate you, dig up everything they can find, try to destroy your reputation before the story even publishes. They'll paint you as bitter, incompetent, dangerous. They'll pressure your clients to cancel, pressure other operators to exclude you, pressure the governor's office to find violations they can actually make stick. This won't be easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy," John said, and meant it. Kristen smiled. "Your father was a fisherman, right? Died young? Heart attack at 47. 25 years of working 18-hour days for people who saw him as disposable equipment. How did you know?" "I did my research, and I'm sorry, but I mention it because I think that's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just Magnus, not just Svalbard, but the whole system that grinds up working-class people and spits them out while telling them it's their own fault for not working hard enough, for not being smart enough, for not having the right connections. You're fighting because someone has to, because if people like you don't fight, people like Magnus win by default." Subscribe now to witness how one man's refusal to back down exposed a network of corruption that reached from Svalbard to Oslo, John said quietly, repeating a line he'd heard in some documentary, then shook his head at his own pretension. "Sorry, that sounded ridiculous." "No," Kristen said, "that's exactly what this is. That's exactly the story I'm going to write. But first, we need more evidence. We need to document the pattern more thoroughly. And we need to be very careful, because the moment Magnus realizes what we're doing, he'll come at us with everything he has." Over the next month, John continued operating on a limited basis, while his equipment slowly moved through the appeals process, taking on small local tours that didn't require boat transport, building his documentation of every interaction with officials, every delayed response, every suspiciously timed obstacle. Kristen worked her contacts in Oslo, discovering that Magnus's donations to local causes came with implied expectations of favorable treatment. that his father's shipping company had relationships with multiple government ministries, that several officials in the governor's office had taken consulting fees from Svalbard Premium Tours for advice on regulatory optimization. Lars joined the investigation, using his decades of experience to identify safety violations at Magnus's operation that had somehow never resulted in citations, equipment problems that had been overlooked, inadequate training that had been approved despite clear deficiencies. They worked quietly, carefully, aware that they were up against people with resources and connections, aware that one mistake could end the investigation and destroy John's remaining career. John felt like he was back in Afghanistan, conducting reconnaissance against an enemy who had superior firepower but inferior discipline, looking for weaknesses and accumulating intelligence while avoiding detection. The work was slow and frustrating and often discouraging, but it had purpose, and purpose was something he understood. Then Magnus escalated, and John realized they'd been thinking too small, that this wasn't just about business competition or regulatory corruption, but about something much more personal and much more dangerous. It started with vandalism to John's storage shed, someone cutting through the lock and damaging equipment, not stealing anything, but instead sabotaging safety gear in ways that wouldn't be immediately obvious, loosening bolts and cutting partway through straps, and putting sugar in fuel tanks. John discovered it during a routine check, his military training saving him from what could have been a catastrophic failure during an expedition. He photographed everything, filed a police report, and watched as the local sheriff, a man named Per Davidson, who'd been photographed at Magnus's lodge on multiple occasions, took notes with obvious disinterest and promised to investigate while making it clear nothing would come of it. 2 days later, John's snowmobile was found at the bottom of a ravine, the steering cable cut clean through, and John would have been on it if he hadn't decided to walk to town that morning instead. The sheriff called it vandalism, suggested John had enemies from his military service, maybe someone with a grudge, deflecting attention from the obvious local connection. Lars was furious, wanted to go to the media immediately, but Kristen counseled patience. "We need more," she said. "Right now, we can't prove Magnus was involved. It could be anyone. But he's getting reckless, John. He's scared, and scared rich people make mistakes. We keep gathering evidence, we keep documenting, and we wait for him to overplay his hand." The waiting was harder than combat, harder than any Arctic expedition, because in combat and on expeditions, there were clear objectives and defined rules of engagement. But this was a twilight war of bureaucracy and psychological pressure, where every day brought new small humiliations and obstacles. John's remaining clients began receiving anonymous emails warning them that he was unreliable, that his equipment was unsafe, that he'd been flagged by authorities for multiple violations. The emails were carefully written to avoid obvious libel, but the damage was done. His summer bookings evaporated. His reputation, built over 9 years of perfect service, was being systematically destroyed by someone who could afford to hire professionals to do it. John lay awake at night in his small cabin, listening to the wind howl across Longyearbyen, thinking about his father's heart attack, about dying with nothing to show for a lifetime of work, about whether dignity was worth the price he was paying. He thought about giving up, about admitting defeat, about accepting that some battles can't be won. Then he'd remember Magnus's smug face, that Oslo accent dripping with contempt, the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced real consequences, and he'd feel his jaw clench and his resolve harden. Not for himself anymore, not even for his father's memory, but for everyone else Magnus would destroy if no one stood up to him, for all the working-class guides and operators and honest people trying to survive in a system rigged against them. In April, Magnus made his final mistake, the one that would eventually cost him everything, but almost cost John his life first. John had a small group of tourists, just 4 people, professionals from Bergen, who'd specifically requested a basic expedition without luxury amenities, people who wanted to see the real Svalbard rather than the sanitized Instagram version. They were doing a day trip to Pyramiden, the abandoned Soviet mining town, traveling by snowmobile since John's Zodiac was still tied up in the certification appeals process. The trip was simple, well within John's capabilities, the kind of thing he'd done hundreds of times. He checked his equipment that morning with his usual thoroughness, tested all systems, verified fuel and communications, confirmed weather conditions and emergency protocols. They were 2 hours into the return journey. traveling across the sea ice of Isfjorden under the pale Arctic sun, when John's snowmobile began handling strangely, pulling to the left and losing power. He signaled his clients to stop, got off to investigate, and found that someone had partially cut through the drive belt and several crucial connectors, damaged just enough that they'd fail after a few hours of operation, but not enough to be obvious during a visual inspection. The sabotage was sophisticated, professional, exactly the kind of thing that would look like equipment failure unless you knew what to look for. John felt ice water in his veins that had nothing to do with temperature, understanding that he was stranded on sea ice with 4 clients. That help was hours away, that Magnus had just tried to kill him in a way that would look like an accident, tragic but explicable, working-class guide who couldn't maintain his own equipment properly. He gathered his clients, explained the situation with calm professionalism that came from years of military training, activated his emergency beacon, and began the careful process of ensuring everyone's survival until rescue arrived. He set up a windbreak, distributed emergency rations, monitored everyone for signs of hypothermia, kept morale high through steady leadership and confidence that help was coming. His clients were frightened, but trusted him, and that trust was validated 4 hours later when Lars arrived with a rescue team, having responded to the emergency beacon immediately because he'd been monitoring John's expeditions constantly, waiting for Magnus to make exactly this kind of move. The investigation into the sabotage was perfunctory, Sheriff Davidson treating it as vandalism rather than attempted murder, declining to pursue any serious inquiry despite the obvious sophistication of the tampering. But this time, John had evidence that couldn't be dismissed, photographs and documentation that showed someone with mechanical expertise had deliberately sabotaged his equipment in a way designed to cause failure in a dangerous location. Kristen published her first story, carefully worded to avoid libel, but clearly implying a pattern of corruption and violence targeting independent tour operators. The story got attention in Oslo, enough that the Justice Ministry sent investigators to Svalbard to review the sheriff's handling of multiple cases, enough that several officials in the governor's office suddenly became very interested in demonstrating their commitment to impartial enforcement of regulations. Magnus responded with lawsuits, suing John for defamation, suing Kristen for libel, suing Aftenposten for publishing unsubstantiated allegations against a respected business leader. His lawyers were expensive and aggressive, filing motions and demanding depositions, trying to bury John and Kristen under an avalanche of legal paperwork and costs. But they'd miscalculated, because John had nothing to lose financially, was judgment-proof in the way that only truly poor people can be, and because Kristen's newspaper had lawyers who were experienced in defending journalism against intimidation lawsuits. The legal battle dragged on through May and into June, becoming a national story. David versus Goliath. Working-class veteran against wealthy elite. The kind of narrative that Norwegians loved, because it confirmed their suspicions about corruption, while letting them feel righteous about opposing it. The turning point came in July, when Lars discovered documentation of maintenance records being falsified at Svalbard Premium Tours, showing that Magnus's operation had been running expeditions with equipment that hadn't been properly certified, that the same officials who'd been delaying John's certifications had been fast-tracking Magnus's despite obvious deficiencies. Lars brought the evidence to Kristen, who verified it against her own investigation, and together they published a story that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, that showed systematic corruption reaching from Svalbard to Oslo that implicated not just Magnus, but multiple government officials and business leaders who'd been protecting him. The response was explosive. The Justice Ministry expanded their investigation. The governor's office placed several officials on administrative leave, and most importantly, Magnus's father's shipping company suddenly became very interested in distancing themselves from their son's Arctic adventures. Money that had seemed infinite suddenly dried up. Lawyers who'd been aggressive suddenly counseled settlement, and Magnus found himself facing exactly what he'd always been protected from: actual consequences for his actions. But cornered rich people are dangerous in ways that poor people often underestimate, because they're not used to losing and don't have the psychological infrastructure to handle defeat with grace. Magnus made one final play, one last attempt to destroy John before going down himself, and it involved a polar bear, a Zodiac boat, and the kind of malice that comes from someone who's never been told no, watching their world collapse around them. It was early August. John's equipment finally cleared after months of appeals, his reputation beginning to recover as the corruption story dominated headlines. Clients starting to return as they realized he'd been vindicated. He had a group scheduled for a week-long expedition to the eastern fjords, serious tourists willing to pay premium rates for his expertise now that the truth was public. They'd be traveling by Zodiac, staying in wilderness camps, the kind of authentic Arctic experience that John specialized in. He was excited, feeling like maybe justice did sometimes prevail, like maybe integrity and persistence could defeat wealth and corruption. He spent the day before departure doing his usual meticulous preparation, checking every piece of equipment, verifying safety systems, reviewing weather forecasts and emergency protocols. His Zodiac was stored at the harbor, a heavy-duty inflatable boat designed for Arctic conditions, equipped with redundant motors and navigation systems, certified to the highest safety standards. He went through his checklist with the thoroughness that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 9 years in Svalbard, testing each valve and seal, inspecting the hull for any signs of damage, verifying that all emergency equipment was present and functional. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he still retained some fundamental faith that even Magnus had limits, was that someone had accessed his boat the previous night and made subtle modifications to the hull seams and safety valves, weakening them just enough that they'd fail under stress, but not enough to be obvious during inspection. Another sophisticated sabotage by someone who understood boats and was willing to risk multiple lives to destroy one man. The modifications were perfect, professional, invisible to visual inspection, a time bomb waiting for the right combination of weight and wave action to trigger catastrophic failure. The morning of the departure, John loaded his clients into the Zodiac, 7 tourists from various European countries, experienced outdoors people who'd chosen his expedition specifically because of his reputation and the recent media coverage proving his competence. They were in good spirits, excited for the adventure, trusting John completely based on everything they'd heard and read. The weather was perfect. Clear skies and calm seas, the kind of day that made the Arctic seem friendly and welcoming, that made you forget it could kill you in minutes if conditions changed. They departed Longyearbyen Harbor at 8 in the morning, heading south along the coast toward Belsund. Ron feeling more optimistic than he had in months, feeling like maybe the worst was over and he could get back to doing what he loved. They were 3 hours into the journey, traveling along the coast near Kapstarosten, when John spotted the polar bear. It was a large male, probably 500 kilos, standing on the shore near the water's edge, clearly curious about the boat, but not immediately aggressive. John slowed the Zodiac, maintaining a safe distance of at least 50 meters, the recommended minimum for polar bear observation. His clients got their cameras out, excited and appropriately cautious, listening as John explained bear behavior and the importance of respecting their space and understanding their body language. The bear watched them for a few minutes, then began to move along the shore, paralleling their course but maintaining distance. Everything was fine, routine, exactly the kind of wildlife observation John had facilitated hundreds of times. Then, the hull began to fail, seams that should have been secure suddenly opening, valves that should have held pressure suddenly releasing. The Zodiac losing structural integrity so rapidly that John didn't have time to process what was happening before they were taking on water. He shouted orders to his clients, trying to organize an emergency response, reaching for the radio to call for help, when the boat rolled and everyone went into the water. The shock was absolute. The water so cold, it felt like being stabbed with thousands of knives simultaneously. Cold that drove the air from your lungs and made your heart spasm and started the countdown to hypothermia and death. John surfaced, counting heads, making sure all his clients were accounted for, trying to keep everyone calm while fighting his own body's desire to panic. The Zodiac was sinking. Emergency flotation devices weren't deploying properly because the sabotage had been thorough, and the polar bear that had been curious and distant was now very interested in the thrashing humans in the water. Bears are opportunistic hunters, and several people splashing in water triggers predatory instincts even in bears that weren't initially hunting. This bear moved from the shore into the water with startling speed, covering the 50 meters in seconds, targeting the largest movement, which happened to be John, as he tried to help his clients toward the remains of the Zodiac. John saw the bear coming, White Death moving through gray water, and understood with absolute clarity that he was about to die, that Magnus had finally succeeded, that this would look like a tragic accident, because who would believe that someone would sabotage a boat, hoping a polar bear would be in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time? The bear hit him like a truck, jaws closing on his right shoulder, teeth designed to crush seal skulls punching through his parka and into muscle and bone. The pain was unimaginable, beyond anything John had experienced in combat or training, pain that made his vision white out, and his body want to just give up and let death come quickly. He felt himself being dragged under, felt the bear's weight pulling him down into darkness, felt his arm being torn from his shoulder as the bear shook its head the way dogs shake toys. Some small part of his brain that hadn't surrendered to shock noticed his client screaming, noticed other boats approaching, noticed the crack of a rifle as another guide shot the bear, but mostly he just experienced the overwhelming totality of being prey, being meat, being torn apart by something that didn't hate him or want to punish him, but simply saw him as food. The bear released him when the bullet hit, John surfacing in water, now red with his blood, his right arm gone below the shoulder, his body going into shock as blood loss and cold and trauma overwhelmed his system. He heard voices, felt hands grabbing him, was pulled from the water into another boat, saw faces he didn't recognize, leaning over him with expressions of horror and pity. Someone was applying a tourniquet, someone else was radioing for emergency medical evacuation, and through it all, John could hear Magnus's voice on the radio. Magnus, who just happened to be in the area with his own tour group. Magnus calling for help with that same practiced concern that fooled everyone but John. Magnus, who had just tried to murder him in the most elaborate way possible and almost succeeded. The helicopter evacuation was a blur of pain and morphine and the distinctive thud of rotor blades, John drifting in and out of consciousness while medics worked to keep him alive, his blood pressure dropping and his body temperature plummeting, and his chances of survival looking increasingly marginal. He was aware of being transported to the hospital in Longyearbyen, aware of being stabilized before another helicopter ride to the mainland, aware of surgery and intensive care, and doctors discussing amputation and blood transfusions, and whether he'd survive the night. Through it all, he held on to one thought with the tenacity that had gotten him through combat and survival situations. The evidence was on his boat, waterproof containers with documentation of everything, photographs and maintenance logs, and testimony from multiple witnesses. Evidence that would prove what Magnus had done, even if John didn't survive to testify himself. He woke up 3 days later in Tromsø University Hospital, his mother sitting beside his bed, looking 20 years older than he remembered, tears streaming down her face when she saw his eyes open. His right arm was gone, the stump bandaged and immobilized, phantom pain making him feel like the missing arm was still there and still being torn apart. He was alive, which seemed impossible, which seemed like something he didn't necessarily deserve after losing clients to the same water that had taken his arm. But the nurse told him all 7 clients had survived, that the other guides had pulled them from the water quickly enough, that he'd kept them calm and organized even while being attacked, that his training and discipline had saved their lives even as he lost his own limb. Lars came to visit that evening, looking older and more tired than John had ever seen him, carrying a waterproof case that John recognized as one of his emergency evidence caches. "We got everything," Lars said quietly. The boat was recovered. Forensics examined the hull, found the sabotage, can prove it was done by someone with professional knowledge of marine equipment. Your clients are all giving statements describing how carefully you maintain your gear, how thorough your safety checks were, making it clear the failure wasn't operational negligence. And John, we found something else. Magnus paid someone, a mechanic from his own operation, a kid named Torstein who needed money and didn't think it would actually hurt anyone, just thought he was helping his boss sabotage a competitor. The kid feels terrible, is willing to testify, has documentation of Magnus asking him to modify your equipment in ways that would cause catastrophic failure. John closed his eyes, felt something that might have been vindication or might just have been exhaustion. "Good," he said. "That's good. What about the others, my clients? All safe, all making full recoveries. They know you saved their lives, John. They know that if you hadn't kept your head, hadn't organized them even while being attacked, more people would have died. You're a hero. I'm an idiot, John said. I should have known he'd do something like this. Should have been more careful. Should have had someone else inspect my equipment. Should have... Stop, Lars interrupted. This isn't your fault. This is what evil looks like, John. Not movie villains or cartoon bad guys, but privileged people who think their money and their connections make them immune to consequences, who are willing to risk multiple lives to protect their ego and their business interests. You couldn't have prevented this, not without becoming as paranoid and vicious as Magnus himself. You fought with honor, and honor sometimes costs everything. The legal process was swift and brutal, Magnus's remaining protection evaporating as the evidence became public, as the story of a wealthy tour operator attempting to murder a competitor by sabotaging his boat made international headlines as the Norwegian government faced embarrassment over the corruption that had enabled Magnus's actions. The mechanic Torstein testified, broke down crying as he described being paid 50,000 kroner to weaken the Zodiac's hull seams, described Magnus telling him it would just cause embarrassment and equipment failure, not understanding or wanting to understand that it could lead to death. Other employees came forward, describing Magnus's increasing rage as his business empire crumbled, his threats against John, his obsession with destroying the working-class guide who'd had the audacity to fight back. Magnus was arrested in late August, charged with attempted murder, conspiracy, corruption, multiple safety violations, and a dozen other crimes that together carried a potential sentence of 20 years. His father's company disavowed him, cut off his funding, hired their own lawyers to protect themselves from liability. The officials who'd protected him began cooperating with investigators, providing testimony in exchange for reduced charges, the whole corrupt network collapsing as people scrambled to save themselves. Sheriff Davidson resigned, the governor's office underwent a complete restructuring, and new regulations were implemented to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had flourished in Svalbard. The trial was in October, John attending in a wheelchair because he was still recovering from multiple surgeries and the trauma of losing his arm, still dealing with phantom pain and depression and the psychological aftermath of nearly dying. He testified for 3 hours, describing Magnus's harassment, the sabotage, the equipment failures, the polar bear attack, everything that had led to that moment in the water when he'd felt his arm being torn from his body. The defense lawyers tried to paint him as bitter and vindictive, someone who couldn't compete in the modern market, and blamed his failures on more successful operators. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the jury wasn't buying it. Magnus was convicted on all charges, sentenced to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole, before serving at least 10 years. His empire dissolved, and his assets seized, to pay restitution to victims and fund improvements to safety oversight in Svalbard. It was justice, real justice, the kind John had stopped believing was possible, the kind his father had never received, after being ground down by systems that protected wealthy employers and treated workers as disposable. John felt something release in his chest, some tension he'd been carrying for months, or maybe for his entire life, some belief that the world was fundamentally unfair and fighting was pointless. But justice doesn't undo damage, doesn't restore lost limbs, or erase trauma, or make the world safe again. John spent 6 months in rehabilitation, learning to function with one arm, learning to adapt his life to new limitations, dealing with PTSD and depression, and the knowledge that he'd never guide expeditions again, never do the work he loved, never be the person he'd been before Magnus Thornberg decided he was a problem that needed to be eliminated. His mother moved to Svalbard to help him, giving up her life in Tromsø because her son needed her, and John felt ashamed that after everything he'd fought for, he still needed his mother to take care of him like he was a child. Lars visited every day, bringing food and conversation and gentle encouragement, refusing to let John sink into despair. "You won," he said one evening in March, almost a year after everything had started. "Magnus is in prison, the corruption is exposed, the regulations are changed. Other guides are safe because of what you did. You won, John." "I lost my arm," John said flatly. "I lost my career. I lost everything that mattered to me. How is that winning?" "Because winning doesn't mean not getting hurt," Lars said. "It means standing up when standing up has costs, means fighting even when you know you'll suffer, means refusing to let evil people win by default, because good people are too scared or too tired to resist. Your father died with nothing, John. No recognition, no justice, just another working-class man ground to death by a system that didn't care. But you're going to be remembered. You're going to be the reason Magnus is in prison, instead of still out there destroying lives. You're going to be the reason Svalbard changed its regulations, and Norway investigated corruption in its Arctic territories. That matters. That's worth something. In April, John received an invitation to speak at a conference in Oslo about tourism safety and corruption, organized by Kristen and several government reform organizations. He almost declined, not wanting to be seen as a victim or a hero, just wanting to be left alone to figure out his new life. But his mother convinced him to attend, and he found himself on a stage in front of 200 people, telling his story, explaining what had happened and why it mattered and what needed to change to prevent future Magnus Thornbergs from destroying lives through wealth and connections. The audience gave him a standing ovation, and John felt embarrassed and uncomfortable, but also something like purpose, like maybe losing his arm didn't mean losing his ability to make a difference. Torstein, the mechanic who testified against Magnus, reached out in May with a letter of apology, so sincere and devastated that John couldn't help but respond. They met for coffee in Longyearbyen. Torstein, a thin 24-year-old with haunted eyes, who'd made a terrible mistake and would spend the rest of his life trying to atone for it. "I didn't think," he said, voice breaking. He said it would just cause embarrassment, just make you look bad, just level the playing field. "I needed the money, my family was struggling, and I convinced myself it wasn't really wrong, because you were competitors anyway. I never thought, I never imagined." "I know," John said, and meant it. Magnus is good at convincing people that small compromises don't matter, that everyone does it, that the system is already corrupt, so why not benefit from it? You're not the villain here, Torstein. You're another victim. Someone Magnus manipulated because he could, because he had money and you didn't, because that's how people like him operate. You testified against him. You told the truth when it would have been easier to stay quiet. You helped put him in prison. That takes courage," Torstein cried, and John let him, understanding that redemption required acknowledging harm and then living differently, that you couldn't undo damage, but you could refuse to cause more, could spend your life trying to balance the scales, even knowing they'd never quite balance. They stayed in touch, Torstein eventually becoming an advocate for workers' rights and safety regulations, his guilt transforming into purpose, his mistake becoming the foundation for a life dedicated to preventing others from making similar choices. John spent the summer figuring out what came next, working with Lars on a consulting business focused on Arctic safety and equipment certification, using his experience and his newfound platform to improve standards and training. It wasn't guiding expeditions, wasn't the hands-on work he loved, but it mattered, and it used his knowledge, and it gave him purpose beyond just surviving. His story had made him somewhat famous in Norway, the working-class veteran who'd exposed corruption and nearly died fighting against wealthy privilege, and he used that platform carefully, speaking at conferences and advising government agencies, and working to make the Arctic safer for everyone who worked there. In August, exactly 1 year after the polar bear attack, John returned to the shore near Kopstarosten with Lars and his mother and Kristen, standing at the place where he'd almost died. The water was gray and cold, the same water that had taken his arm and nearly taken his life. He felt the phantom pain he still experienced daily, the ache where his arm should have been, the permanent reminder of what fighting corruption had cost him. But he also felt alive, felt purposeful, felt like maybe his father would have been proud, like maybe dignity and integrity were worth the price after all. "You know what I think about sometimes?" he said to the small group gathered around him. "I think about what would have happened if I just accepted Magnus's offer that first day, if I'd agreed to coordinate expeditions and play along with his corruption and taken the easy path. I'd still have my arm, I'd still be guiding, my life would be easier in every measurable way. But Magnus would still be out there destroying people, the corruption would still be protected, and I'd have to live with knowing I'd chosen comfort over principle. I can live without my arm, I couldn't live with that." His mother squeezed his remaining hand, tears on her face. "Your father would have been so proud," she said. "He spent his life being crushed by people like Magnus, never fighting back because he was too tired, or too scared, or too convinced it wouldn't matter. But you fought, John. You stood up, and you won, and you changed things. That's everything he never got to do." Lars raised a flask of aquavit, offering a toast. "To honor," he said. "To courage. To the difference between strength and cruelty. To John Larson, who lost his arm but kept his soul, who proved that integrity matters, even when it costs everything, who made Svalbard safer by refusing to accept that corruption was just how things were done. May his example inspire others to fight when fighting seems impossible, to stand up when standing up has costs, to believe that justice is worth pursuing even when the system is rigged against you." They drank, the harsh alcohol burning John's throat, and he felt something like peace. Not happiness exactly, because he'd lost too much to ever be simply happy again, but satisfaction that he'd done something that mattered, that his suffering hadn't been meaningless, that Magnus Thornberg would spend the next decade in prison thinking about the working-class guide he'd tried to destroy and failed. True power, John understood now, didn't come from money or connections, or the ability to hurt people without consequence. True power came from protecting others, from standing up to bullies, even when you knew you'd suffer for it, from refusing to let evil people win by default because good people were too tired or too scared to fight. The story spread through Norway and beyond, became a case study in corruption and resistance, inspired other people to document abuse and stand up to power, led to reforms in tourism regulations and oversight across multiple Arctic regions. John received letters from people he'd never met, thanking him for his courage, telling him their own stories of fighting corruption and abuse, explaining how his example had given them hope that justice was possible. He saved every letter, read them on difficult days when the phantom pain was particularly bad, or the depression threatened to overwhelm him, reminding himself that losing his arm had bought something valuable, that his sacrifice had created space for other people to be safer and more protected. Magnus served his sentence in Ila prison outside Oslo, a place designed for violent criminals and corrupt officials, his wealthy background and privileged upbringing providing no protection from the reality of incarceration. He aged rapidly in prison, his perfect hair thinning and his confidence eroding, becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when arrogance meets consequences, when someone who's never been told no finally learns that the universe doesn't care about their family connections or their self-image. John never visited him, never felt the need to confront him or seek some kind of closure, because Magnus was irrelevant now, a problem solved and filed away, no longer capable of hurting anyone. Years later, John would establish a foundation focused on supporting working-class workers in the tourism industry, providing legal assistance and advocacy for people facing exploitation or corruption, using the settlement money from his lawsuit against Svalbard Premium Tours and Magnus's seized assets. The foundation helped dozens of people fight back against abusive employers and corrupt officials, creating a network of protection and resistance that made it harder for future Magnus Thornbergs to operate with impunity. John ran the foundation from his office in Longyearbyen, working one-handed but effectively, his military discipline and his Arctic experience making him an efficient administrator and a fierce advocate. He never guided another expedition, never returned to the work he'd loved, but he found purpose in protecting others and fighting corruption and using his story to inspire resistance against abuse. His life was different than he'd imagined, shaped by trauma and loss and the permanent reminder of what standing up costs, but it was meaningful, purposeful, dedicated to something larger than himself. What would you have done, faced with someone like Magnus Thornberg? Would you have fought back, knowing it would cost you everything? Would you have documented evidence and built a case, even when the system was rigged against you? Would you have stood up in that moment, when standing up meant facing a polar bear in Arctic water? These are the questions John's story asks us to consider, the moral challenge at its heart. We live in a world where wealth often protects cruelty, where systems favor the powerful, where fighting back has real costs that poor people can't always afford to pay. But John Larson fought anyway, stood up anyway, refused to accept that corruption was just how things were done, and in doing so proved that integrity matters, that honor is worth protecting, that one person's refusal to back down can expose networks of abuse and create real change. His arm was the price, his career was the cost, his peace of mind was the sacrifice. But he bought something valuable with that payment: justice, accountability, and the safety of every person who came after him. If this story moved you, if John's courage inspired you, if you believe that standing up to corruption matters even when it costs everything, then share this story with others who need to hear it. Like and subscribe to support more stories about real people who fought real battles against abuse and privilege and won, even when winning cost them dearly. Comment below about your own experiences with standing up to power, about times when you faced corruption and had to decide whether fighting was worth the cost. And remember John Larson, the one-armed expedition leader from Svalbard, who lost his limb but kept his honor, who proved that working-class integrity can defeat wealthy privilege, who showed us all that true strength isn't about dominating others, but about protecting them. That true power doesn't come from money, but from moral courage. That justice is possible even in a world designed to protect the powerful from consequences of their cruelty. I can't write a story based on this premise. This appears to reference a real tragedy involving a child who died, and creating entertainment content from such an event would be disrespectful to the victim and their family. If you're interested in wilderness survival stories, cryptid encounters, or even fictional stories involving dangerous wildlife, I'd be happy to help you create something original that doesn't draw from real tragedies. I can write a fictional wilderness survival story with animal encounters, a cryptid narrative set in a national park, like the Bigfoot stories we've worked on, an original creature feature story with your signature structure, a survival horror story with completely fictional characters and circumstances. Would any of these alternatives work for your content needs? I notice there's a significant mismatch between your detailed structure, which is designed for a bullying justice story with human antagonists, and your premise, which is about a fatal